All right, my friends, today is a very good day. We are going to be talking all about the history of the Corvette. And obviously we'll be talking a little bit about the third generation C3 right behind me with the 427 engine. Let's do it. All the way back to the 1950s, and that's important to paint a picture of the automotive times. Okay, now this is post World War II, where you had all the servicemen coming back over from Europe, where they had seen a lot of European roadsters. They were spending a lot of their purchase dollars on imports, and naturally our American automotive manufacturers took note. You see, at the time, we didn't have an American Roadster or a sports car for Americans to purchase. But that would soon be solved by the man, the myth, the legend, Harley Earl. Yes, and we're gonna have to talk a little bit about him. You see, Harley Earl was kind of the king of design at GM, all right? He created Dagmar bumpers. He popularized tail fins. He really kind of created the concept of the concept car, and eventually he would also be vice president of GM. And you see, Earl was a pretty clever guy. He was watching all these imports flood in, all those dollars going across the seas, you know, your Jaguars, your MGs, your Triumphs, all of that. And he thought, we can do something about that. And that is when he decided to start working on the Corvette concept. And it wasn't known as the Corvette concept originally. So it was known as EXX122, all right? And what they did was they went into the old GM parts bin and they tossed a few things together. They also put an inline 6, the Blue Flame inline 6, into the original concept car. Not quite enough power there. And they created the concept, all right? The concept, the original Corvette concept car. It showcased in 1953 at the New York Auto Show, or Motorama. And it was a hit. It was a sensation. It was popular enough that old Ed Cole decided, we're gonna have to put this into production. Now, side note, I will say this, did they use all already existing parts? Yes, that's smart. That was pretty average, that. But what they did do was go a little adventurous and bold with the body. They used fiberglass, which was pretty cutting edge innovation for the time. All right, so it does phenomenally at the motor show, causes a sensation. Ed Cole's like, you know what? Let's make it a thing. And literally overnight, it goes from concept to planned production car like that. Now, naturally, I ought to tell you a little bit about Ed Cole. He's kind of a big figure. He is considered the father of the small block Chevy V8, all right? He led the production and design of the Corvair, all right? And he is the one that took the meek first generation or first few years of the Corvette and worked alongside Zora Arkov-Duntov to make it the mean machine we know now. All right, it's 1953 and the Corvette hits the dealerships. It's America's first sports car. And it does very lackluster in sales. Some would say it was a total flop. You might be wondering why that was. Well, like I said, they slapped that inline 6 in there that wasn't a lot of horsepower, not a lot of power, especially if it's competing against the Jaguars, MGs, etc., Triumphs of the day, okay? And it reportedly had very lackluster performance. Then, in 1955, they went ahead and tossed that inline 6. They put in the Chevy V8, and then we had some horsepower, reaching 195 horsepower. And then a year later, 1956, is when the Corvette would enter the racing scene. And you know what they say? Race on Sunday, sell on Monday. And it was then that the Corvette finally became an icon. And it was around this time that we would see the introduction of the young Zora Arkov-Duntov, a fascinating legend that we are going to have to talk more about. You see, before Zora came to GM, he had already escaped from Russia, smuggled gold, flown bombers for the French Air Force, and he had already driven the Le Mans a few times for both Allard and Porsche. Kind of a badass. I think it's also important to note that Zora had actually seen the original Corvette concept car in 1953 at the New York Motor Show, all right? He fell in love with it, and he sent a letter to Ed Cole stating his intent to make the Corvette into the mean machine we see it as now. Full circle there. All right, now in 1963, we would see the introduction of the second generation, the C2. All right, we would see the introduction of the Corvette Stingray. And some of you might be saying, well, where did Stingray come from, right? Well, where it came from, Bill Mitchell, prolific designer Bill Mitchell, had been spending quite a few days, weeks, hours, I don't know, fishing in Florida, catching a couple of stingrays. And you can see how he introduced the essence of the back end of a Stingray into the back end of the Corvette Stingray. Now, the second generation was overall smaller than the first generation, okay? And 1963, the first year of its introduction, was also the only year we would see the split-faced window. Highly coveted. Now, interesting to note, Zora, all right, the father of the Corvette, he would soon to be known as, didn't like the split window. Even though, I mean, very aesthetically pleasing, he didn't like it because it interfered with your rear vision. Now, something to note is that the design of the C2 was heavily influenced by the Stingray Concept Racer and the Mako Shark. It was designed by Peter Brock, who is a legend. And for the first few years, it would be powered by the Chevy Big Block V8 before going on to the 427cc engine. And since we're talking about engines, this is also around the time period that Zora was advocating for the Corvette to be a mid-engine car. Well, we all know that didn't happen until 2020. Can you imagine how frustrated Zora must have been? And then in 1968, we would see the introduction of the C3, the third generation. And this would go on to be the longest running and best-selling Corvette, all right? That first year selling over 30,000 units. And by long running, I mean long running, 1968 to 1984, all right? And with it, we would see an aggressive change in design. It was patterned off of the Mako Shark 2 concept car, okay? And it would be the first time we see the removable T-top. Correction, all right? The C3 was 1968 to 1982, all right? 1984 would be when we finally see the introduction of the C4, the fourth generation. And this was when Corvette went ahead and just did a whole revamp of design. Everything new, ground up, all right? And this is also when they first made a genuine attempt at aerodynamics, and they accomplished a 0.34 drag coefficient. And the C4 generation really did introduce a lot of innovation, okay? So traction control, anti-lock brakes, it was an all-electric instrument panel, okay? And the first to do a one-piece removable hardtop. So with the C4, that was also one of those moments where Zora thought his dream was going to come true, that it was going to be a mid-engine Corvette. But they wanted to use the V8, all right? And the V8 would not fit behind the configuration. They could not figure out how to put it behind the driver, all right, and fit. So they would have had to have gone to a V6, and they're like, the American public, they won't like a V6. And so yet again, The irony that Zora fought year after year, generation after generation, to try and get the Corvette to be mid-engine. Now, there was some truth to it. Americans were obsessed with the V8, all right? Oftentimes, people were obsessed with bigger engines. They thought bigger meant better. Not always the case. Enzo Ferrari, guilty of that too, okay? It was his son, Alfredo Dino Ferrari, that would first initiate Ferrari ever creating an engine under 12 cylinders or something like that. I'm getting off track. Back to the Corvette. Let's take a little moment to talk about the ZR1 with the LT5 engine in it, all right? All aluminum, 5.7 liter V8 cranking out 375 horsepower. Side note, all right, the LT5 engine also had a little help from Lotus, all right, and Mercury Marine. Oh, you know what time it is. Oh, you already know. It's beer 30. Let's see if we actually have any beer in the fridge. Maybe I'll drink. So fast. Delicious, a little Shiner Bock, Texas beer, can't beat it. Oh my god, it's so tasty. It tastes so good on the lips. All right, so 1997 rolls around and we would have the 5th generation Corvette, all right? They completely, from the ground up, did a redesign and a lot of innovations, okay? A lot of the innovations that you would see go into the C6 and the C7. Also very important, they would accomplish a 50-50 weight distribution, which makes a big deal when you're driving. Now this is also when you would see the factory-backed Corvette racing team come onto the scene, and they would go on to win the Le Mans 3 times. Kind of a big deal. A lot of folks say this is when the Vette was reinvented. Just a little reminder, if you aren't already following and you love car content like I do, then go ahead and press the subscribe button, which might be there, or it might be here. Either way. Cheers. And then in 2005, we would see the introduction of the 6th generation, and they had an emphasis on making this Corvette leaner and meaner, all right? The base model was a 6-liter V8 that could shoot out 400 horsepower, and then the following year, they switched it around a bit, cranking out 505 horsepower. And then it would be 4 years later that Chevy would bring out, sorry, we have we're in a working mechanic shop. For those of you who aren't familiar with this channel, well, this is our family mechanic shop that my father started over 40 years ago. It's kind of paradise, if you could imagine. Growing up here was amazing. Oh yeah, back where we were. Now, 4 years later, Chevy would bring out the ZR1, all right? Now that was a, do I get this right? Do I have this right? 6.7 liter supercharged V8 that could shoot out 638 horsepower. 6.2 liter supercharged V8. So, it's close. All right. So, around this time, Chevy starts to get a little bit concerned about their Corvette's image. All right. They are realizing that it's beginning to be known as the old man's car. All right. At this time, they did a study, and half of all Corvette purchasers were over the age of 55, which I don't consider that old at all. But really with that, they had realized that they needed to completely revamp their engine with the upcoming 2014 C7 Corvette. And with the C7, they would bring back the Stingray name, all right, cranking out 465 horsepower. We would also see the Z06 back on the scene with a supercharged V8 reaching 650 horsepower, if I remember that properly. And side note, this was also another one of those time periods where we thought we were going to see a mid-engine Corvette. Nope. And now we are at present time, the grand finale, all right? In 2020, we finally get the mid-engine Corvette that Zora had been dreaming of for ages. For ages. Like generation after generation. I think the only thing disappointing about this supercar without the supercar price is that it is not manual option. Who knows? Maybe in the future. Could be. Now you got options for powering, okay? You can either get the 6-liter LT2 cross-plane V8 capable of 495 horsepower, or you can get the 5-liter LT6 flat plane capable of 670 horsepower. Really, I think what's most important about the C8, aside from I really like that Zora's vision was finally done, you know what I mean? He was over here a genius, you know, a true racing engineer and race car driver, and he's like telling everybody, please, let's do a mid-engine sports car, and they just bean counters are telling him no. And so finally, I think that's very important. Also, it really took Corvette from being, like I said, the image of being, which I never really thought it was, but whatever, you know, the image of being a old man's plaything to being like an American supercar. So, kind of special. All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed our little trip down classic car history, because this is kind of my thing. I love classic cars. I love automotive history. And if that's your cup of tea, well, then go ahead and press the subscribe button, whichever side it is on here. And until next time, cheers.